Thank you so much for joining me on the record. We are 1 month since the beginning of the war with Iran. In your mind, where are we in terms of safety and in terms of humanitarian aid?
In terms of safety, I'm thinking about the civilians across the countries in the region, and I worry. I worry beyond words, because if you look at what's happening in Lebanon, and let me start with Lebanon, over 1 million of people have been displaced already. And they've been displaced several times already in the course of the last 2 years. They fear that they have nowhere to go, and they do not have anywhere to go anymore. Across the region, there are people affected, and we have difficulties bringing in more material, and we have difficulties across Iran, for instance, to move because of lack of access and lack of communication, and because we hadn't pre-positioned the amount of people and aid for such a large-scale conflict. And with the supply chains broken, it will be difficult for the humanitarian system to respond to the current escalation if we will be able to respond in any meaningful sense at all. So the whole burden is now falling on the National Red Crescent and Red Cross societies that are sending their volunteers, and many of them are injured, many of them are losing their lives because they move without having the security guarantees that they would normally need to have in order to operate. So they're just taking more and more risks and putting more and more burden on themselves.
And you have a target on your back.
Look, the respect for humanitarian workers, the respect for the emblem, for the Red Cross and the Red Crescent is declining, because we are operating today in an environment where increasingly leaders are saying there are no rules. No rules means you can hit and run, you can basically shoot at everyone, and that includes humanitarian workers. And I have not seen such a degree of disrespect for established universal humanitarian rules as I see today.
Did this start with the invasion of Ukraine?
Look, I've been observing a continuous, over the course of the last few years, a continuous and deliberate hollowing out of international law, and especially of international humanitarian law. Now, we are guided by the Geneva Conventions. It's not our mandate to say who started the war and who broke the UN Charter. But once a war is starting or is happening, there are rules that apply. You cannot deliberately target children, you cannot target women, you cannot leave the elderly behind, you cannot torture detainees. These rules have to be upheld, especially as more and more countries and more civilians are being drawn into this.
And they haven't been upheld in Ukraine or in Gaza?
I don't see it, because I see too much suffering. I see too many children dying, and I've seen them in many parts of the world. And I travel to these parts and I can see it for myself, and it's horrendous. I cannot tell you how much it pains me that states leaders are not able to finally start investing in de-escalation, because since I took office 3 years ago, we've been counting more and more international armed conflicts and non-international armed conflicts compounding. We are over 130 now. And when I came, it was below 120.
You've described Gaza as hell on earth. How would you describe what we're seeing today?
It's a nightmare. When is this going to stop? I want to be sure that state leaders and those middle powers capable and willing to put their skin in the game to mediate, that they remain at the negotiation table to find solutions that will last. Confidence has dropped drastically over the last years, given the pattern of hostilities into just negotiating ceasefires. We have to aim at more solid political solutions, and as these hostilities continue, I have to be sure that there are the right people sitting at the negotiation table to find a way out, because we will not be able to absorb this. And nobody is asking the civilian population. Nobody is asking the families, the mothers and the fathers, what they feel for their future of their children.
Yeah. Tell me about the shortfall, because at a time when the world is at war, European countries are saying they want to spend trillions on defense. That's obviously because of the war in Ukraine, but closer to home, in the region, this is about reopening the Strait of Hormuz, a vital lifeline. It's impacting oil and gas prices, it's impacting the bond markets, and essentially it's going to impact your bottom line.
Look, since 23, we have continuously cut 10 to 20% out of our budget year on year. How long can we absorb this? We are doing more with less, but there's a limit to more with less. Our colleagues are also exhausted. Sometimes they sit over time in a given context and continue working because we just cannot replace them. And the same again applies to the national societies. As we are seeing less funding coming our way and more conflict and more humanitarian fallouts happening, then definitely what you will see is the national societies and the local providers of humanitarian assistance to be in the same, in exactly the same, if not a worse situation.
If you had a figure to put on it, what would that number be?
I mean, look, the cuts have already been 50% in most of the aid budgets across the big donor countries. That's significant.
Yeah.
And the continuation of humanitarian need grows exponentially. Mm-hmm. Look, I'm telling you again, look at what's happening in your region, across the GCC countries. You know, the
and
fear
those are the
of
donor
the people,
countries.
The fear of the people in the donor countries, the costs that arise from this warfare, from the conduct of hostilities and from the attacks happening. But then look at what's happening in Lebanon. Look at what's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank. And look at how far away we are still from a comprehensive recovery and reconstruction of Syria. 15 years after the conflict broke out, we still see too many people living in rubble and too many children that have never seen a school from the inside. Recovery is becoming more and more expensive because the new technologies in warfare can create much, much more destruction at scale in a much shorter time than what we had seen 20 years ago, just as an example.
And just in spite of the fact that we've had years now of war in Ukraine, that asymmetrical warfare, it's as if no one was paying attention, because it's exactly what the Iranians are using on the Gulf countries, specifically UAE.
Look, my focus is always on how can we see an end? How can we de-escalate? How can we build bridges and pathways back to serious negotiations?
Do you see any of that happening today?
As I said, I hope it is happening. I'm insisting that it happens. But you have to be aware that with every continuous erosion, not only of trust, but also of the normative frameworks that guide these negotiations, it will be more and more difficult to return to the negotiation table.
Yeah.
So warfare will continue to escalate, and we've seen an escalation over the last 3 years that is exponentially gaining in speed. Now, as you've run out of military targets, wars turn into wars against civilian infrastructure.
Which is what we're seeing in the UAE.
And this is exactly what you're seeing.
Yeah.
And here, the devastation is double. You have the cost of recovery, but you have the immediate impact on your own population that cannot go back to normal life for extended periods of time, because it will take time to recover from this. But if the escalation doesn't stop, the damage will increase and the hope in recovery will decrease. So people are going to ask themselves, where am I safe? Where can I go? And look at global migration flows. They are already surpassing anything we have seen in previous decades.
Yes. And the UAE specifically was that island of stability, or perceived to be for all of this time. In your mind, how quickly Can a country like the UAE recapture that narrative following a conflict like this, particularly with regards to that asymmetric warfare?
I'm calling on all states equally to return to a position where they prioritize de-escalation and where they prioritize and invest in collective, simultaneous de-escalation. And it will be easier for them to do so if they put the fate of civilians, if they put the security and safety of their own people at the center. Mm-hmm. If they acknowledge that there are two ways of acquiring safety for their people. One is through warfare, and the other one is through political negotiations and investments in real agreements. And, putting the necessary political weight into this and whatever is attached to it for agreements to happen. You can say there is a military solution to a situation, but trust me, I have not seen it. Mm. Any situation that escalated over the past 3 years since I took office, and I've been working in related contexts before I joined the ICSC, created situations where we had to stay. We have been in Gaza for decades. But what happened in the last 2 years has made us bring in more material and more people continuously. Mm. The situation in Sudan, the situation between Russia and Ukraine, the situation generally in the Horn of Africa shows us that we will need to stay much, much longer in many more contexts because of what is happening and because of the levels of devastation and because of the absence of serious negotiations. Mm-hmm. I have not seen any improvement in any of the regions that we operate in, and today we are operating in every region of the world. And this is what I'm concerned about. Mm-hmm. Because I'm asking myself, how is history going to define this decade of war? This decade of continuous rise in the number of armed conflicts.
And the desensitization of people.
And the numbness to conflict. And this is even more dangerous.
Because we're more tuned in, if you will, because of our phones than we've ever been before. People have actually been able to see what happened in Gaza. They were able to see the displacement in Lebanon. And the fear, frankly, of those sitting in Dubai as we see all of these missiles and drones going overhead. We see all of this, and yet the international response is still extremely, extremely lax.
Because we don't look at war anymore as the last resort. We have moved to a culture where war is considered a political state that can be employed or that can be initiated at any given moment in a given context. But I was a student in a time where war was considered the exception and where political negotiations were considered the priority. I'm not saying it always worked. I'm not saying there hadn't been wars. But the level of suffering, the level of destruction, the absence of political messaging that we need political negotiations, that was not the case when I was young.
Given that historical context, do you think that we could see a political solution for Lebanon?
Of course. I mean, there has to be a political solution for any situation in the world, because our history is older than this.
Would that be peace with Israel?
Our history is older than 70 years.
Because that's what the Americans are saying. They need to declare peace with Israel.
Any country in the region has to declare peace with their neighbors, but Israel is a part of that. Israel also bears a responsibility to enter into peace with their neighbors, as do all other countries in the region. This is not a one-sided responsibility.
Yeah.
Peace requires two. Nobody fights alone, and nobody makes peace alone. There's always two sides of the story, and they both bear equal responsibility to make peace in order to protect their people.
Do you see that happening with the current leadership?
As I said, I wish I saw more investment in peace, because all I've seen over the last 2 years is escalation, continued escalation. and because of the asymmetric nature of warfare today, the escalation can continue for a long time. And again, the longer it takes, the more civilian infrastructure is impacted, the more displacement we see, because drones create a situation where nowhere is safe anymore, nowhere.
Tell me about messaging. And I speak about this in the context of, I was just in the United States, where something very curious is happening, particularly within the Republican Party. There's a split. Those who agree with the president to back Israel at all cost, and those who, Tucker Carlson among them, would say, you know, every life is precious. And whether we're talking about the civilian population in general or specifically children, there's no justification for the murder of children and civilians. In your mind, is that shift a good thing? Because they're making it about humanity versus politics.
The ICRC is a strictly neutral and bipartisan organization, meaning we don't comment on political dynamics. My focus is not on, you know, lobbying political parties or convincing political parties. Who I need to convince are the state leaders. Now, no matter what the constitution or political positioning is of a given government, any government belongs to a state that has ratified the Geneva Convention. So I'm messaging to state leaders and to, you know, heads of military, to ministers of foreign affairs, asking them to find ways of returning on a path towards negotiating ceasefires. And since we're growing out of the possibility of just negotiating ceasefires in the given complexity, to really invest in peace. And this will happen if everybody returns to the basic principles that can guide anyone in defining what is allowed and what is not allowed. I've never met any head of government or any head of state who denied the fact that children need to be protected. And how do you protect children? I mean, everybody is investing in war. Everybody is investing in defense. I'm not questioning that. We are not a peace organization. But the moment you invest, you enter a higher possibility of being involved in a conflict. And that moment will define how safe your people are, how safe the children in your country are, and what measures have you taken to protect them. And we all know that the common investment and the common return to these basic principles can help bringing parties to a negotiation table. We've seen it over and over again.
Yeah.
And we saw it. We saw it again with the release of the hostages from Gaza and the return of the Palestinian detainees that paved the way towards a ceasefire.
So if we're talking about trillions spent on defense, we have to also talk about the humanitarian aspect. Is that money or is that a way of thinking?
You can never assume that military preparedness will protect your people. The moment you invest in military preparedness, you have to invest in humanitarian preparedness, because as I said, and as you're seeing now, wars turn immediately against the civilians. Where do they shelter? How do you ensure that they will always have access to water? How do you ensure that your health system will not collapse? And look at how much damage to this drones, very cheap drones, can do within a day. You know, drones today can deprive people from drinking water overnight.
Yeah. What is the situation that your folks see in Iran today?
What we see is that the population is afraid.
Of its leaders?
The population is afraid because there's constant shelling, but also because they don't know where to go, and they very often cannot access the necessary information. Very often they're
because the government's blacked it out.
From communication.
Yeah.
You know, there's a compilation of threats coming against them and very little means for them to navigate and to ensure that they can find themselves in safety where they have access to food, water, and electricity, by what messaging they receive and by what they hear and by how they see their environment looks like at the moment. It must be horrifying for any mother that is trying to protect their children. And we don't make a difference between mothers, no matter where they are on either side of the line. They're just protecting their children.
So they're in a silo of silence.
I mean, it's very difficult to navigate across the countries at the moment. And what we see is a national Red Crescent Society that is going out of their way, trying to bring people into safety, but they're nowhere matching the challenges at the moment. And we are also trying to bring in more assistance. We are trying to replenish our warehouses, but this will take time, and this is a challenging process at the moment.
We've just heard from the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, talking about Gaza and talking about putting together a sovereign wealth fund to develop Gaza. How far away, in your mind, are we from seeing that reality?
I appreciate every effort to bring a dignified life back to the population in Gaza, because I visited Gaza repeatedly during hostilities. There's no dignified life yet in Gaza. And given the restrictions to bring in material that we would need to rehabilitate the infrastructure that is necessary and make sure that children can go back to school and don't have to live in rubble anymore, these restrictions are still preventing that. So again, I hope that the international attention will not move away from what the people in Gaza have gone through, what they are going through still today. And of course, my heart goes out also to the people in Israel. I've met the families of the hostages so many times. And I know that as we speak, there's shelling happening across the region, and that includes Israel as well.
Yeah. With Lebanon, when your people are there on the ground, tell me what it is that they're seeing. I mean, is the government helping them and assisting them and to do their work? What could be done to make their work easier?
I'm very concerned about Lebanon, most at the moment, because things are happening that should be stopped immediately. What we see is a destruction of the existential fundamentals for people to live in a given territory. I mean, the destruction of hospitals, the destruction of water systems is one thing, but if you destruct, including bridges and means of transportation, will the million that has been displaced at the moment and that has been requested to evacuate be able to return to their homes ever? And there's, again, less and less space for people to shelter. They are living in the streets. They have a very uncertain future. We have to support the government. We have to support the people of Lebanon, and we have to make sure that hostilities stop before too much destruction has happened, before facts have been created that will be very difficult to reverse. And of course, the Lebanese people have been watching how Gaza was transformed into a territory where people live in rubble, and they are traumatized by, the thought that the same thing could happen to them.
Do you see that as a possibility?
Of course, it's always a possibility that this happens, but I call on leaders to prevent this from happening. It is extremely important that this does not happen.
Tell me the message in your mind to leaders today from the organization. It's not just about more funding. It's also about changing the rules of this game, and not focusing specifically on making war, but also on the humanitarian aspect and making peace. What does that peace look like?
Peace looks like a situation where recovery starts happening, where rubble starts being removed, where houses are starting to be rebuilt, where children are going back to school, where health systems are functioning, and where formal economies can happen in order to create options for people, because they don't want to live off humanitarian assistance. They don't want to live in makeshift shelter, being brought rice bags occasionally, as it is the case at the moment. They want to be able to buy their own food with the money that they make in a formal job.
Yeah.
I'm asking children across the region, I'm asking youth. I asked a young boy recently, what is your dream for the future? And the only thing he said was, I want to have a real job. I want to have a job where I go to work in the morning and come back in the evening and where I make a salary. I've worked in this region, in the Middle East region, for so long, over decades. Mm-hmm. I've seen other situations. I've seen families going out, celebrating birthdays, and I don't see them doing this anymore. Mm-hmm. The very same places where I've seen families doing this, in many countries, in many situations across the Middle East, there is now rubble. Mm-hmm. How far are the leaders in the region and everybody who has an influence on the situation and who is involved willing to take this?
Yes. And to that question of formalized economies, you have an economist background. Are the international institutions that we have today set up to deal with this mess that we've made of things? And I'm talking about the World Bank, the IMF, and the United Nations, which is becoming less and less effective over the years.
If they are not set up to cope with this, they will be made to cope with this. You know, it's our collective responsibility. I myself, as a leader of a large organization with 20,000 staff across the globe, engaged directly or indirectly in what is happening, we all have a collective responsibility to make sure that our institutions are up to speed and capable to respond as much as possible. Mm. But we will be thrown under the train collectively, one after another, no matter how, if no rules apply.
Yeah.
We have to come back to these universal agreements as a joint reference framework on how we operate and how we respond to this crisis. But we have to agree that we have to return to a vision for peace and kiss goodnight the idea that there is a military solution to political problems.
Have you seen any indication that the American president agrees with you?
The American president speaks of peace, and that must give us hope. I hope that there will be peace. And anyone who can influence the situation, we will provide, the support we can within our mandate to promote peace. And that includes the US, but that includes every country across the globe, because they are all state parties to the Geneva Conventions. They all agreed at some point on the rubble of the Second World War that there will never be a war led without rules. And I want all state leaders to come back to this notion and then start working within that framework on something that all parties agree will lead to a de-escalation.
Thank you for joining me on the record.